2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 1 through 18. Therefore, since we have this ministry, because we were shown mercy, we do not give up. Instead, we have renounced secret and shameful things, not acting deceitfully or distorting the word of God, but commending ourselves before God to everyone's conscience by an open display of the truth. But if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we are not proclaiming ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. Now we have this treasure in the clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry the death of Jesus in our body, so that the life of Jesus may also be displayed in our body. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that Jesus' life may also be displayed in our mortal flesh. So then, death is at work in us, but life in you. And since we have the same spirit of faith in keeping with what is written, I believed, therefore I spoke. We also believe and therefore speak. For we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you. Indeed, everything is for your benefit, so that, as grace extends through more and more people, it may cause thanksgiving to increase to the glory of God. Therefore, we do not give up. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed day by day. For our momentary light afflictions is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal.
Well, good morning again. If we haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Mitchell. I have the honor and privilege of serving as one of the elders here at Redeemer Fellowship, Kuwait. In 1985, a young struggling actor named James was looking for some inspiration. Things had not gone according to plan to this point. To be honest, they had never really gone to plan in his life. It seems when he was young, his parents faced some hard times. So much so that for a time, James and his family lived in their Volkswagen van in relatives' front yard. So on this day in 1985, at the age of 23, he wrote himself a check. You remember checks, the paper things we used to write for the bank? He wrote himself a check. No real money in the bank, and needing something to hope for, he wrote that check for $10 million US, roughly 3 million KD, and post-dated it 10 years into the future. If things worked out the way he had hoped, he'd be able to cash that check. If not, he was likely heading back home to a steel mill to work. So he stuck that check in his wallet and got to work. By the time those 10 years were up, young James had made it big. He had starred in the wildly popular Ace Ventura: Pet Detective, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber. No movies that I would recommend you watch this afternoon or anytime soon. And now Jim Carrey was making roughly $20 million US for each and every movie he made. He had done it. He had made it big. He was the veritable Canadian rags to riches story. And for the better part of 30 years now, Jim Carrey has been making some of the more popular movies coming out of Hollywood. along with his big paychecks. But it was only 10 years ago, or 10 years after making it big, that he sat down with a journalist for the Ottawa Citizen, and in a moment of reflection, he gave us one of his more famous lines. This one not scripted on a page or read for the screen. He said, "I think everybody should get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of so they can see that it's not the answer." How many struggling 23-year-old actors need to hear that? How many successful 50-year-old lawyers and doctors and bankers would dare to be so honest? But we'll circle back to that later. If you've been with us over the past few months, you'll recall we've taken a bit of a break from the book of Exodus for the holiday season. Now, don't worry. We haven't abandoned Exodus altogether. Martin is going to pick back up in Exodus 25 next week to start the new year. 2 weeks ago, however, Olson spoke from Psalm 2 and pointed to the coming of the true Son of the Father in a world where nations rage and animosity abounds. Last week, we looked at Isaiah 6, which is typically seen exclusively in light of Isaiah's call and commission, but more specifically was centered on God's holiness, our own sinfulness, and then God's forgiveness and commission. Personally, the passage stood out to me as one of both despair and hope. Despair, as Isaiah was told that he would speak to a people who wouldn't listen or understand. They would be deaf and dull and blind. Not exactly what any prophet or preacher hopes for. And yet, right there at the end, tucked away in the most unlikely of places, we catch a glimpse of Christmas. The image of a tree is given, but not one tall and glorious, decorated with ornaments and tinsel. It's actually a tree that has fallen. And if we're not paying attention, we miss what the Lord said to Isaiah. Like the terebinth or the oak that leaves a stump when felled, the holy seed is that stump. The one prophesied all the way back in Genesis. The seed who would crush the serpent's head. He was coming. Our sermon text for today comes from Paul's second letter to the Corinthians. Both 1st and 2nd Corinthians, we should note, were written with very specific reasons in mind. They were not generalized collections of Christian teaching, even if they're generally applicable for Christians of every age. The Corinthian church at the time of the letter's writing had been influenced by teachers who had set themselves against Paul and the other apostles. At the heart of their teaching was what many theologians have called over-realized eschatology, which is just a fancy way of saying they had a sure and unfounded confidence in their own spirituality and assumed that all of the blessings of the age to come had already been given and were being experienced in their fullness now. This confidence and these assumptions led to moral permissiveness and an arrogance that belied Paul's lived experience and the experiences of other believers around the world at that time. Keep that in mind as Paul speaks to even us this morning. Our outline for this morning's passage comes in 3 parts. 3 words, actually. Verses 1 through 6, we'll look at Paul's ministry. For you note-takers out there, Paul's ministry. In verses 7 through 15, we'll see the manner of that ministry. And finally, in verses 16 through 18, we'll look through the motivation for that ministry. Motivation. So we'll see ministry, manner, and then motivation. That ministry itself, this section, will be viewed in 3 parts also. Paul's ministry was personal, it was particular, and it was proclamation. Personal, particular, proclamation. Our section on manner will also be broken down into 3 parts. You're seeing a theme here. It was external, it was emboldened, and it was extended. External, emboldened, extended. And we'll go back over these as the sermon progresses. Our last section on Paul's motivation, likewise, 3 parts. It was internal, it was incomparable, and it was invisible. Oh yes, friends, alliteration abounds this morning. I feel like apologizing, but I do every time, and I should stop apologizing for the alliteration, so this is my last apology. It's not planned, it just happens. So now that we have all that set, let's pause for a brief moment and ask the Lord to stir our hearts yet again in prayer. Let's pray. King Jesus, we love you. Apart from you, apart from the work of the Holy Spirit, we can do nothing. Growth does not come. Discernment does not come. Wisdom does not come. We ask that you would give us eyes to see. We ask that you would give us ears to hear, hearts that reflect and are enlivened to the gospel yet again, that good and gracious work of Christ on the cross. We ask that as we look at 2 Corinthians 4, that you would do the work in us. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. So here we go. Let's begin with Paul's ministry in verses 1 through 6. Therefore, since we have this ministry, because we were shown mercy, we do not give up. Instead, we have renounced secret and shameful things, not acting deceitfully or distorting the word of God, but commending ourselves before God to everyone's conscience by an open display of the truth. But if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing. In their case, the God of this age has blinded the minds of the unbelievers to keep them from seeing the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. For we are not proclaiming ourselves, but Jesus Christ as Lord, and ourselves as your servants for Jesus' sake. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. So here we have, in 6 short verses, a summary of Paul's ministry. Paul, who would go from town to town, speak in both synagogues and open markets, facing hostility and open scorn. He gives us an outline of how these things happened. And where does he begin? But with himself. It was personal. The cause or reason for his perseverance begins with the cross. He tells us plainly in verse 1 that at the foundation of all that was mercy and grace, he had himself found in Jesus. That mercy and grace worked itself out in Paul's life in what he called renouncing secret and shameful things. In other words, confession and repentance. Perhaps the easiest word to overlook here at the beginning is this word renounce. It isn't really a word that has carried over into our day and age, although the meaning is quite clear. It's one of verbal rejection followed by a personal rejection, or to declare one's abandonment. Verbal rejection followed by a personal rejection. One would think, in light of Paul's scuffle with the super apostles at Corinth, that he would want to manage his personal brand a little better. And yet, to keep those shameful things in his life secret would be, in fact, to deny the very mercy and grace he had been shown. Paul's life was an open book. It was personal, and it was open for all to see. But not only was it personal, it was particular. That is to say, the message Paul carried did not hit everyone the same way. In describing the particular nature of the gospel, Paul actually picks up on language he used towards the end of chapter 3. There, Paul looks back at the time of Moses. And without giving away too many spoilers, remember, we're getting back into Exodus. I'll just say here that in Exodus 34, after having spent time in the presence of the Lord himself, Moses would cover his face with a veil because the Israelites would be prone to stare and, it seems, damage their eyes. The veil then stood as a reminder of God's presence, experienced by one of their own. It was the radiant glory that enlivened them to his presence. In much the same way, the temple veil would shield God's people from his presence that would consume them. This veil stood as a barrier. So back to chapter 4. The veil we see here is not one given by the Lord for protection. In a turn of mimicry and mockery, this veil was placed over the eyes of the perishing by the God of this age. Now that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? God of this age. It could be interpreted as either a personal God or in a way that is generalized, like the spirit of the times or the Zeitgeist for our German-speaking friends. I tend to see it as the latter. And what an age in which we live. Perhaps the defining characteristic of our own age, according to social anthropologists, is one of distraction. We have so many lights and bells and whistles and smoke and lasers and temptations pulling at us at a near breakneck speed. It's a wonder anything of value gets through to us at all. The real, the unassuming, the quiet gets lost. With blindfolds secure, those around us are in no better position to tell if the rooms of their lives are dark or lit. The hearts of some are veiled, and for others, the veil has been removed. And yet we see that Paul was undeterred, realizing that some would be deaf and blind and unperceptive, like we saw last week in Isaiah 6, he shared all the more. For as odd as it might sound, he wasn't the one holding the flashlight or the torch, whatever you call it. He proclaimed the one who does. Did you notice the wording here in verse 5 and 6? Did you notice the analogy? We kind of breezed by an important word in verse 4. It's that of light. Paul used it there as an analogy to what happens when someone comes to a realization, an understanding, that moment of clarity when the gospel makes sense and becomes real. Here in verses 5 and 6, Paul makes clear that he is proclaiming Jesus Christ alone. Unlike the super apostles at Corinth, Paul takes a step back and says that the proclamation on its own is unable to lift the veil, so to speak. It is useless to shine a light for the blind or to play music for the deaf. On our own, we are unable to do anything to bring life where there is death or light where there is darkness. But God can. And the analogy Paul uses here for salvation is none other than Genesis 1. For God, who said, "Let light shine out of darkness," that is to say, let there be light, he has shown in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of God's glory in the face of Jesus Christ. Scottish commentator F.F. Bruce put it this way: as the old creation was inaugurated by the shining of light to dispel the darkness which lay upon the face of the deep, so too the new creation was inaugurated by the shining of light to dispel the blindness of unbelief. And when that light comes on, when God Himself breaks through the abyss and the chaos and the darkness that engulfs the human heart, what do you see? The face of Jesus Christ Himself. Who else would you rather have see you for all that you are? Who else would you rather know you more intimately than you even know yourself? Who else would you rather share the weight of human experience with than Jesus? There's something powerfully telling in the human experience when we are recognized, to be exposed and known and seen for who you are, and yet to be loved all the same. So having seen the content of Paul's ministry in verses 1 through 6, let's move on to the manner, or we could have said means, it's another M word, of that ministry in verses 7 through 15. Now, we have this treasure in jars of clay jars, so that this extraordinary power may be from God and not from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not abandoned. We are struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry the death of Jesus in our body, so that the life of Jesus may also be displayed in our body. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that Jesus' life may also be displayed in our mortal flesh. So then, death is at work in us, but life in you. And since we have the same spirit of faith, in keeping with what is written, I believed, therefore I spoke. We also believe, and therefore speak. For we know that the one who raised the Lord Jesus will also raise us with Jesus and present us with you. Indeed, everything is for your benefit, so that as grace extends through more and more people, it may cause thanksgiving to increase to the glory of God. In giving our outline earlier, we divided this section into 3 parts: external, emboldened, and extended. So of the 3, the first subsection here actually runs from 7 all the way through verse 12. And you might be asking, external in what way? After all, the opponents we mentioned before were deemed for being showy and built on pretense. Likewise, in many parts of the Bible, Old and New Testament alike, we're told that internal matters of the heart mean more to God than outward appearances. To be honest, by external, I actually mean 2 things. In the first sense, external, I mean coming from outside himself. And in the second, I mean on full display. Paul himself uses wording in this section that gives us both. First off, in one of his more well-known metaphors, he likens the believers to a jar of clay and says that the extraordinary power that inhabits us is from God and not from us. Friend, apart from Christ, there is nothing in you, nothing in you that is intrinsically and instinctively that brings about the kind of life that pleases God. There is no good that you could do or have done that would gather any merit before the sovereign King of the universe. Apart from Christ, you are dead in your trespasses, covered in filthy rags. You are poor, pitiable, blind, and naked, unable and incapable of pleasing Him. You are a hollow shell of a creature, lifeless to the things of God. But God, in His great kindness, shone into your hearts, lifted your spirit out of the grave, and gave you newness of life. And I hope and pray that is true of you today. And what is the payoff for Paul here in this chapter? It's here that we come to the second part of our word external. Because this treasure was in this shell of a body, it was unmistakably clear to all who could see it that it was from God. Paul's life put the work of God on full display. It all came apart from him and went right back out for others to see. And this external dimension of Paul's ministry can be seen in verses 13 and 14 as it was emboldened by the Spirit. Paul here actually quotes from Psalm 116, which says, "I believed, therefore I spoke." Like here, the psalmist there recounts his hardship and persecution, and then points to the loving kindness and grace of God to save him. Paul picks up on the link between what is believed and what is said. Like a light switch that is turned on and reveals the articles and state of the once darkened room, so too our words reveal the inner working of our own heart and thoughts and attitudes. There's this pernicious little quote. It's been floating around evangelicalism for some time now, attributed to the Catholic priest Francis of Assisi, although there's really no record of him having said it, so there's that. It goes something like this: "Preach this gospel at all times, and when necessary, use words." And just as it seems this quote never actually passed over Francis's lips, it most assuredly would never have passed over Paul's. The gospel, friend, the message of forgiveness and grace found in Christ and in Christ alone, this message is inherently verbal. You either speak it and share it, or you don't. You either believe it, and out of an overflow of joy and love, you want others to have it as well, or you don't. Jesus was quite clear on this. Matthew 10, verse 32, "Everyone who acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge him before my Father in heaven." And why is Jesus acknowledging them? Not because they had lived a good life, but because the words of their mouths had verified the work done in their hearts. Those who have experienced forgiveness and grace cannot but help share it with others. And here we come to the extent for which God created the whole world. Verse 15. Indeed, everything is for your benefit, so that as grace extends through more and more people, it does what? It may cause thanksgiving to increase to the glory of God. Gratitude. It's such a small thing. Appreciation, thanksgiving. Coming to the realization in no uncertain terms that apart from the sustaining work of God in the world, you would perish. Apart from the saving work of Christ on the cross, you would still be dead in your trespasses and sins. Apart from the illuminating work of the Spirit, you would be blind to the whole thing. And so we come, not boasting of our own accomplishments, but with hearts of gratitude to the glory of God alone. And so looking at Paul's ministry in verses 1 through 6 and his manner in verses 7 through 15, we're now ready to look at his motivation in verses 16 through 18. Therefore, we do not give up. Even though our outer person is being destroyed, our inner person is being renewed day by day. For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable, eternal weight of glory. So we do not focus on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. For our last section, we've again divided it into three parts. Remember, internal, incomparable, invisible. So now before you go accusing me of talking out of both sides of my mouth, if that's an expression that makes sense, I do realize in the previous section, I have a subpoint labeled external, and now I have one labeled here, internal. Friends, this was intentional. Paul makes it clear here. You are wasting away. The flesh and bone, hair and eyes and other things you see every time you look at a mirror simply won't last. The CSB here uses the word destroy, which is fine and good as a translation. It might happen rather quickly, this wasting away. But the passage of time has shown us that the human body is prone to break down. It's prone to decay and loss and weakening. All the medical advancement in the world, even miraculous healings, they only delay the inevitable. One day, you will pass away. Or as T.S. Eliot put it, this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. And yet, while this is true of the external of our flesh and bone, Paul was not without hope, and neither are we. While the outer person is wasting away, Paul says, for the believer, the inner person is being renewed day by day. And that inner person is what matters. And here we come to the central verse of the whole chapter, the one that sums it all, the reason Paul could write any of it. Our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable, eternal weight of glory. Have you ever wondered how Paul could have said this? Afflicted, perplexed, persecuted, struck down. It sounds awful. It certainly doesn't sound like something people are lining up to experience. Again, the marketing folks need to talk to Paul about his branding issues. But the list could go on. Heartache, loss, grief, abuse, sorrow, anguish, oppression. But how does Paul describe these things? Momentary, light, fleeting, passing, a vapor that rises from the pot and vanishes. And then they're gone. When comparing his present circumstances to the life that awaited, Paul says there really is no comparison at all. He uses the word incomparable. The 70 years and change we might get in this life are just a drop in the bucket. Just a grain of sand on miles and miles of shoreline that stretches as far as the eye can see. For the believer, the affliction is momentary. Glory is not. There's a play on words here in most English translations that actually doesn't appear in the Greek. Earlier, Paul spoke of the light of the gospel shining into our hearts and compares that to the darkness brought about by the veil. Here we see light again, but it isn't a luminous, shining light. It's a light in contrast to what is heavy. These two lights are two different words in Greek. The comparison here, which Paul calls incomparable, is between the light affliction and the weight of glory. The fullness of reality, what some have called more real than any reality you've ever known. The weight and depth and height of God's goodness on full display for all to see. But for those of us in the here and now, living in that moment on the grain of sand on the seashore, what we call the world to come is unseen. It is, as we labeled it, invisible to at least these hazel eyes. I am blinded to it by all that the world has to offer. But one day the veil will be lifted. And like Paul, after his Damascus Road experience, the scales will fall from my eyes, and I'll see things as they really are. The eternal and glorious world that we've not yet known will be our reality with the Creator of it all. By way of application, allow me to leave you with just 3 thoughts. Don't give up. Share with others. Keep it in perspective. First, don't give up. And its corollary, don't give in. My fear in choosing such a long passage for this morning, full of richness and depth, was that we would have to rush through and miss the trees for the forest, as it were. And I'm quite certain I could turn to any of the Puritans from of old and find a sermon or a sermon series on any one of these verses in this chapter. And yet, as a singular thought, we should notice that the phrase, "do not give up," occurs at both the beginning and the end of our text for today. Once, or first, as a declaration by Paul for his own condition, and then once finally as an encouragement to the believers in Corinth. And so, just as we read through Paul's afflictions and saw the reason they didn't deter him, I say with him now, friend, don't give up. I know, I hear some of you say, but you don't know what I've been through. You don't know the long nights in anguish, the months and months and months of tears, the years of waiting and longing. You don't know about the doubts and the questions that linger. You don't know about blow after blow after blow that life has thrown at me. But you don't know. Perhaps not. And perhaps I never will. But I know the one who has dried my own tears. And I say to you, he is ready to dry yours as well. To quote John Flavel, remember that this God, in whose hand are all creatures, is your Father, and is much more tender of you than you are or can be of yourself. Turn to him even now. Likewise, don't give up and don't give in. The temptation to let your heart be satisfied by the things of the world might seem strong, but rest assured, it is fleeting. Don't let a dopamine hit keep you from experiencing real and lasting joy. Or to quote C.S. Lewis from his essay, The Weight of Glory, nature is mortal. We shall outlive her. When all the suns and nebulae have passed away, each one of you will still be alive. Nature is only the image, the symbol, but it is the symbol Scripture invites us to use. And then, in beyond nature, we shall eat of the tree of life. Friend, wait just a little while longer. Don't give up. Secondly, share with others. As we already mentioned in the second section, the gospel itself is a verbal proclamation of what Christ has done. So, like Paul, we are called to share in season and out of season, in joys and pains, with those who are glad to hear it and those who oppose us. Simply put, you don't know when the veil will be lifted. You don't know when God, in his wisdom and sovereignty and goodness, will shine the light of the gospel into the heart of the unbeliever. So share. Share abundantly. Share extravagantly. Share with wisdom. Share with humility. Share with boldness. Share with all who have ears to hear. And leave the rest up to God. For the stark reality is you and I live in a world and among a people who collectively know very little on the saving grace of Jesus Christ. To quote Lewis again, in some sense, as dark to the intellect as it is unendurable to the feelings, we can be both banished from the presence of him who is present everywhere and erased from the knowledge of him who knows all. We can be utterly and absolutely outside, repelled, exiled, estranged, finally, and unspeakably ignored. On the other hand, we can be called in, welcomed, received, acknowledged. Friends, let us be a people who share the joy of inviting others in. For it may be possible for each to think too much of his own potential glory hereafter, but it is hardly possible for him to think too often or too deeply about that of his neighbor. And lastly, keep it in perspective. This world is not your home. You are but a pilgrim, a stranger, a sojourner. Friend, time is fleeting. You'll be here but a moment. Fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. Consider the joy of being with the one who will make all things new and seen for what they really are. And that's the hope of eternity, isn't it? To be exposed and revealed and known and seen for who you are, and yet to be loved all the same.